Well, I'm here with Josh Branham, and we're talking about his amazing new book called What Are You Waiting For? A Young Leader's Guide to Changing the World. Love the book. And Josh, in chapter 2 of your book, you describe a season of your life this way. You say, the real world set in, and I stopped dreaming. Now, this was in the context of having big dreams as a kid and then getting into adulthood and then kind of settling for what was safe and predictable. Okay. Are you starting to see kids who aren't even dreaming big as kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's two main reasons why kids stop dreaming. Kind of what I experienced growing up was the idea of disillusionment. It's the idea of, the real world and, get a real job that's practical, right? You trade like the possibility for just things that are practical, things that make sense on paper. For me, I wanted to be a comic book artist at one point in time. I remember when I was really young, I thought, I want to be a ninja. Like that was a career or an occupation, right? And then, the older you get guidance counselors in school, or you get parents, you get mentors, and they're telling you, well, why don't you think of something a little bit more like a real job that you can get that makes sense? And that's well intentioned and that's good. And I think that disillusionment typically sets in for most kids in their teenage years, right? Middle school, high school. But another reason why kids might stop dreaming or maybe not give themselves time to really dream big about the future is this idea of distraction. I think we live in, a media saturated age, the digital age, and just kind of like the immense amounts of screen time and comparison that go along with social media. And I think maybe for younger kids, there's this temptation to look at everyone else's life on display. Everyone else is living their dream, right? And they're watching videos with like trick shots, or they're watching videos of, people doing all these kind of crazy things online, almost living vicariously through other people's dreams, that they're not maybe spending as much time thinking about what is God calling me to do or what can I do. At the same time, I do think there is something that's just, you know, part of being young, of dreaming. I remember last year I went to my daughter's kindergarten graduation, and one of the things they did was had every student answer the question, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And there was a lot of dancers and pop stars. That was one of the things. Like, there was a few kind of like, I want to be a dentist, or I want to, I think maybe my daughter said she wanted to be a veterinarian, which I was like, that's a good, that's like a good, but a lot of people, and you see somewhat of the reflection of, well, those kids might be watching on social media a lot of pop stars, or they're listening to Taylor Swift, or they're interacting with the world in that way. And so I think there is something though about the concept of the younger you are, the more you consider the possibilities that, I could be a ninja, I could be a pop star, I could be, kind of whatever. And the older you get, you kind of grow out of that a little bit. And so I think there is power in that concept of possibility.
Now, so you've written this book, What Are You Waiting For? A Young Leader's Guide to Changing the World. What message does your book say to the young person who is already kind of cynical about life? The word you use, disillusioned. They're already saying, well, what's the point? What could I possibly do? How
Yeah,
does your book speak to that person?
yeah, for sure. I mean, that's in some ways one of the perfect kinds of people to read a book like What Are You Waiting For? Somebody who's maybe kind of lost hope that they can really be a disruptor, that they can be a world changer, that they can kind of even kind of move the ball down the field. And I would just tell that person, and somebody needs to tell them God can use you, that God wants to use you, that there is purpose, that He created you on purpose for a purpose. And maybe for people who find themselves in that position, maybe they've encountered older leaders who have said the opposite, or who've communicated that message one way or another, the opposite. That, kind of older leaders who have a cynicism of their own that they carry with them. It's like, hey, it's not even worth your time trying. I find that it's interesting with like New Year's resolutions. Like, the older somebody is, the less that I find that they make New Year's resolutions. And I'm not like a huge believer that, New Year's resolutions will really, amount to anything, right? Statistics show that most people give those up within a few weeks. But typically young people still kind of buy into those kind of practices, right? And I think one of the big messages is just God wants to use you. And maybe there is kind of that self-doubt of, well, what could I even do? And I would just say, well, consider that all things are possible with God. And that if God wants to call you to do something, if he's going to call you to do a work, then he is going to see you through that. He's going to be with you every step of the way. And so I think there's a necessary element of inspiration that especially younger leaders need to hear. But then there's also the practical side of like in equipping and like, well, what do I do with that? And knowing that you're not alone in that, but that God is with you and that even other people are there to walk alongside you is really powerful. And I would also say that there's probably maybe hand in hand with that cynicism of like, what's the point? I can't even do anything. Maybe there's even some frustration with that. I've tried before and, nothing's worked. I've tried to make a difference and it just kind of fell on my face. And I would actually encourage somebody who finds themselves there to harness that frustration. If there is frustration, kind of instead of redirecting that like inward as in defeated, I would say direct that frustration towards passion and passion to do something, to make a difference in the world. So yeah, I think a lot of people today find themselves in that what can I do kind of hopeless place. And that's really, I would say, a central message of the book is to speak life into that.
Yeah. So tell us briefly where you grew up and where you went from there and kind of what you're doing now.
Yeah, I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska, home of the furthest north Denny's in the world. So, fun fact.
Uh-huh.
And just frigid cold, way up in the interior of Alaska. When I was 16, we moved to Australia. That's where my mom's originally from. And so I spent a year over there. And for college, I ended up going to Boise Bible College here in Idaho. And I've been in Idaho ever since. It was very much go to 1 year of Bible college and then kind of go on and, had my whole, academic plan of getting an engineering degree, becoming a math teacher, like all these kind of things. And it was just really clear along that journey that God called me to stay. And I've been in Boise, Idaho for the last 15 years, had the opportunity to be a youth pastor for a season, and then planted a church called Hill City Church here in Boise, Idaho. And yeah, just loving it.
So I want to hear more about the church, but before that, what's like a misconception that people have about Alaska and what's a misconception that they have about Australia? Do people
Yeah,
ever get the two confused like they're the same place or?
yeah. So Alaska, I mean, one of the things when I moved to Australia as an Alaskan, a lot of people outside of the States think it's part of Canada. Like it's just like an extension of Canada.
Yeah.
I think Alaska, there's a lot of misconceptions. Kind of the idea that it's always snowy, like it's, in the North Pole and there's, people live in igloos or, questions like, do you have to take a snow machine to work or like, are there roads, some of that sort of stuff. Those are a lot of the misconceptions that I've faced about Alaska. Also, one of the things people don't know is like how it's presented on a map is it's usually because it's so far away from the continental United States that it's usually in a little box in the corner, and so sometimes people think it's like you know has this it's kind of like an island off somewhere. There's like geographically people sometimes have a hard time pinpointing where Alaska is. And then Australia, I don't know. Misconceptions about kangaroos or dingoes or stuff like that. I guess maybe I didn't live there long enough to really be familiar with the misconceptions down under.
I've seen a map that has the inland part of Australia, and then it's got the water around it, and it's got the line around, the continent, and anything in the line, inside the line says things on land that could kill you. Anything outside the line is things in the water that can kill you, and then the line is basically both.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a misconception or not.
No, that's pretty accurate actually.
Well, that's
So
great.
yeah.
So tell us about the church that you're with, and kind of some of the unique things about Hill City Church and what's going on there.
Yeah, so we have somewhat of a unique church journey. I went from being a youth pastor to being a campus pastor of a multi-site campus, kind of a mega church that had grown and started exploring the multi-site model. In the midst of that time, we had the opportunity to relaunch that campus as an independent church. And so it went from taking kind of like a satellite campus to planting that or relaunching that. And that's what Hill City Church is today. And then a few years into that journey, we had the opportunity with a church that was less than 2 miles away, a historic church building, kind of an older congregation approached us about merging together. So we went from relaunching a satellite campus to now merging with a well-established church in a building that's over 100 years old. And that was all in the midst of the pandemic. We officially merged in January 2021. So in the middle of the pandemic, shutdowns, all this sort of stuff, we're merging with this other congregation. And then this past fall, we launched our own satellite campus, which we will be sending off as a church plant down the road at some point. And so we kind of have this, we're only technically 6 years old as a church, but we have all these kind of twists and turns in that story. And we believe God's calling us to continue to multiply and to send churches out to reach the valley with the gospel.
Oh, that's awesome. I know you can't really paint a picture for us of what your church looks like, that's by the Capitol, kind of in that area, but is there a favorite part of the building that you kind of describe for us? Because I'm guessing it's a beautiful building.
Yeah, it's a beautiful building built in 1910. It was called First Christian Church. Our auditorium has a balcony as well as kind of a sloped main level, and then there's stained glass. There's a giant picture of the depiction of the Good Shepherd, which is behind most people when I'm on stage and they're kind of like facing forward, but I get to see it when I'm preaching all the time. I get to
Mm,
kind of look up, and that's typically where the sun rises, is right through there. So
mm.
that's the stained glass. Jesus holding a sheep, that's there. There's one of the Garden of Gethsemane above like the choir area depiction. So beautiful stained glass, all that sort of stuff, and definitely a vibe change from we were in a remodeled grocery store. That's where we started. Contemporary, dark room, no windows, all of that, to now being in kind of a historic building and bright room and all of that sort of stuff. So there's been some changes as well, but definitely a huge blessing to be in our space. And it's right in downtown Boise. So kind of right where these historic neighborhoods meet up with the urban center of our city. So it's a great place, kind of a central location to be.
That's awesome. So, Josh, you have a real passion for raising up young leaders, and especially, for church ministry. And today we're finding that fewer people are going into church ministry. And, a lot of churches are having a lot of trouble raising up and hiring leaders. So how might this book be helpful for church leaders as they're trying to raise up young leaders?
Yeah, so I think this would be a great book for youth ministries to consider using. Certainly has great application for college age, young adult, really even kind of beyond that as well. But I know, like, part of the problem is like when somebody's like the year before they're about to go to college, trying to recruit that person to go to a ministry school or recruit that person into an internship program at a church, and oftentimes at that point, there's that trajectory, right? That they already have kind of like that plan for their life or somebody else's plan for their life that they're following and taking steps that direction. I just think about me, I was, when I moved to Australia, that was a monumental, like, kind of a wilderness experience for me, kind of being pulled out of my friend group, my context, my school, and where at the same time I was depending on God, closer to Him in prayer than ever. And I became like really solid in my faith as a 16-year-old. And it's in
Mm,
those kind of like formative years that there's an opportunity for students to experience a really strong calling. And so I think that could be a really awesome opportunity if youth ministries use the book as a resource for even just exploring things, not necessarily like read this book and you'll become a pastor, but just giving students the opportunity to dream about God's calling on their lives and to begin to pursue and explore some of that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, I think honestly, the younger the better to have those kinds of conversations with students about purpose, about calling, about giftings, and to allow older leaders, maybe mentors, youth leaders, that sort of stuff, to speak words of calling over those students as well, because it's it's really a tricky thing to kind of figure out. Is like, well, what should I do with my life, and all that sort of stuff. And there's all these kind of messages around, but to allow the church to begin to speak words of calling onto younger generations.
And I'd love for you to walk us through kind of the main premise of the book. And I know that you could take the route of saying, that there are these certain qualities that some people are going to have, and if they have this, then hey, maybe they're going to be great. You take more of the route of saying, as a young person, you've already got these natural capabilities, these natural areas of giftedness or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, and this can be kind of a beachhead for helping them to jump into leadership. So yeah, unpack that for us briefly, if you would.
Yeah, so the premise of the book is really fighting against the maybe when you're older mindset, right? That's kind of this, however somebody arrives at that, I need to wait until I can do significant things for God. Sometimes that comes from what we've talked about, this disillusionment, like this external voices, right? You'll never make a difference, don't even try, that sort of thing. Or even the internal aspect of insecurity. Like, I just don't know if I have what it takes. Maybe I'm not good enough to be, to be used or to make a difference, that sort of thing. Both of those problems lead us to a maybe when you're older. Yeah, maybe after you get 3 to 5 years experience, maybe after you're done with your education, maybe later, essentially. And the premise of the book is, what if you started today? And in fact, if you were to begin to serve God today, if you were to begin to explore possibilities of making a difference for God today, there's actually some unique strengths you have in your youth that in some ways are use it or lose it. You kind of outgrow some of these sorts of strengths. So it's not necessarily, typical like leadership strengths. It's kind of just like things that you can leverage as a young person. And if you begin to operate in those as areas of strength, then you actually don't lose it. You bring those things with you into your adult years, into the rest of your life. And so really encouraging what Jesus talks about with, becoming like a child, having some of those childlike qualities, not all childish, but having some of those, like, well, what are the good things that we have when we're young, that if we actually leverage and use those things, we'll be able to take them with us throughout the rest of our journeys as people. And so, yeah, so just encouraging people, instead of like one day, what if you started today? Instead of saying, yeah, one day I'll get around to going on that mission trip. One day I'll get around to maybe, speaking at church, or maybe using this gifting that somebody said, hey, you'd be good at that, right? Oh, one day, maybe when I'm older. It's really just, the premise is encouraging anyone who reads the book, what if today was day one? What if today was day one of that? Where would you be 10 years from now? And, just kind of helping reorient some of that trajectory towards the things of God and his kingdom.
Yeah, that's really good. What is one of those, areas of strength that's already there that may surprise people? That, yeah, as a young person, this is something that you've already probably got.
Yeah, I mean, there's some I would say this is why the strengths in the book are a little counterintuitive. One of the strengths I talk about in the book is actually weakness. And it's not necessarily that weakness in and of itself is a good thing, but the awareness of weakness, the awareness that you don't know what you're doing sometimes. And this is where kind of like the rookie upset comes from, that somebody who's brand new to something can at times even outperform maybe a seasoned leader or a seasoned athlete, or, there's kind of surprises like, whoa, you're the person we don't really expect to be knowing what they're doing. But all of a sudden, right? You're able to kind of have this huge growth curve. And part of that is really just the concept of when you know that you don't know what you're doing, you're going to invite help from other people. You're going to be more dependent on other people. When you know that you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be more open to learning and listening. And right. So there's going to be some of those kinds of things that what typically would be considered a weakness, like even the idea of weakness itself, for a young person is like, hey, maybe that's not a barrier to actually getting involved. Maybe that's actually an asset. Maybe that's something you have going for you. That showing up as the newcomer who's like asking a lot of questions and trying to figure out what's going on can actually lead you to some really cool places.
Wow. What are some of the main hopes that you have for how God might use this book?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I would love to hear a story one day of someone who read this book, maybe as a high schooler, maybe as a college student, as a young adult, but somebody who reads this book and says, this is how God called me into ministry. That God, you know, like the voice, your voice through the book is how God, spoke calling over my life. And to be like, and here's what I've been able to do for the kingdom. I, became a missionary, or, I started this nonprofit, or even not necessarily, explicitly or exclusively vocational ministry, but even, people being intentional with their lives for the kingdom. I would love to, like, that's like first and foremost, if even one person has a story like that, like the book will have accomplished what it's meant to do. I think as well, there's some really practical ways that I think there's a lot of leaders, like you mentioned earlier, who are like, where are all the young people? What's my transition plan for when, I retire? Like, we need, if we're going to continue and have longevity as a church, we need new blood. We need young people. I think a really awesome application would be for this to be a resource that's used in like leadership development programs at churches. We have actually used it already with some of our interns. 7 chapters of the book, each one has discussion questions. It's a great 7-week internship resource to just like, hey, during your internship, we're going to go through this resource, and there's going to be discussions with a ministry mentor and doing that sort of thing. So I think it's some really awesome potential applications for what God could do with the book. But ultimately, if God uses it to help refine somebody's calling or speak words of calling or encouragement over somebody who otherwise maybe would continue to be disillusioned, disenfranchised, maybe even discouraged, that God would kind of help fan into flame, as Paul says to Timothy, the giftings that they already have. Like that's ultimately the goal. I have a huge passion for seeing God raise up a new generation of kingdom leaders.
Yeah. So what would be the 3 people that need to pick up this book? Give us a picture of the 3 main people that are going to benefit most from this book.
Yeah, I think, any teenager or young adult that is still wrestling with what should I do with my life? That would be like the most obvious person that, this would be a great graduation gift to give to somebody who's like, they graduate from high school and they're like, I don't know, like everyone's asking me, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Like somebody who just wants a resource to read through and process and think through, really like considering the things of the kingdom in not just their plan for their life, but God's plan for their life. That would be the first kind of person, right? Somebody who has kind of like the sky's the limit, they have their whole life in front of them, that kind of person. I think the next person that would really benefit is maybe a more seasoned leader who needs a tool for like, how do I engage the next generation in conversations, and wants a resource, right? Think of it almost like curriculum. Like, what do I go through with this young leader? And I want to have coffee with this person week after week, but I don't really know. Like, otherwise, it's just going to be sitting down, chatting about life, but something that's going to add a little bit of structure and intentionality. That would be a great person to consider reading this book. And then also, I just think anyone who falls into that kind of like category of, man, I feel like the fire that I had for God and His kingdom has kind of dwindled. That there is a lot of like inspiration and equipping and practical steps in the book that I really do hope can help encourage anyone. And that, like you said, it doesn't have to necessarily be somebody who's 60 years old and they've lived a hard, life or whatever. That can honestly still be a 16-year-old who feels somewhat discouraged or burnt out, and helping just people believe again in the possibility of what God wants to do through their lives.
Last question. You'll say you're talking with somebody, or let's say you just have one opportunity right now. Some young person is listening and they are disillusioned, they are distracted, and they are basically kind of following that trajectory of getting out of the game, not really plugging into anything super meaningful. They're not planning to get the book. Of course, we hope that they do, but you get this one shot to just tell them just something straight to them. What's your message for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say to that person, like, I get it. I've been there. I've been in a place where I maybe on the brink of disillusionment and discouragement. I've certainly been in those places, and this is the book that I needed when I was 20 years old and I first felt a calling from God. And so I would just encourage that person, hey, if you'd give me a chance, if you'd give the book a chance, I think God could use it to inspire you. And I think that's really helpful for someone to hear, is that this isn't just like, I don't have a super easy ministry journey where everything's gone great. It's been magical the whole time. But I've seen some difficult times as well, and been in some of those discouraging places. And yet I still believe that God wants to use people wherever they're at in that journey. So I would just tell that person, listen, I get it, and don't give up. God wants to use you too.